It's my pleasure and my honor to turn it over to Bruce Shapiro. And thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us. I know you're very busy.
Oh, Dwayne, this is a delight, and to be with you. Dwayne and I are old comrades in arms from IRE, but it to be with all of you. I was saying to a few folks before most of you got on that I started out as a reporter in Chicago in the 1970s. That's where I sort of first got the idea that this was something that worked for me. So being a Midwestern rooted conversation tonight feels especially fitting. Um, so yeah, I am Bruce. I direct this program at Columbia Journalism School, the Dart Center, which has been around for about 20 years, and our 22 years now. Our focus is on the different issues that come up when, as reporters, we confront violence and crisis and tragedy, whether it's in the intimate sphere of family violence, street crime, all the way up to war, insurrection, pandemic. Um, an awful lot of what we spend our time doing as journalists involves the worst things that happen to people. And at the Dart Center, we try to bring journalists, our tribe, together with evidence based neuroscientists, trauma clinicians, and others to help us do our jobs better. Some of that is about craft, is about understanding how events change the folks, the individuals and families and communities we're reporting on, and what that means for our toolkit. And that will be the subject of our conversation next month. But a big chunk of our work is about how difficult stories and difficult times affect us as news professionals, and what are good strategies for mitigating that and for building up our resilience. That's going to be my conversation with you tonight. This is obviously an astonishing time to be having this conversation. Um, where it's basically to the day a year since the name COVID-19 crossed most of our radar screens. And we have, over the past year, witnessed this succession of, of earthquakes, of crises in our society. The Black Lives Matter protests, the death of Mr. Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, the election, the insurrection, everything else along with the pandemic. So we've got a lot on our plates to think about. We've had to reinvent journalism from the bottom up in a lot of ways in order to do it in a socially distanced way. What I'm going to do tonight is try to give you a little language for thinking about that. I'm going to describe some of the brain science that collides with our work as journalists, that frames the challenges we face a little bit. I'll try to share some strategies both for self care and collegial support, um, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of trauma more broadly. And mainly, I want to have a conversation with all of you. Before I do that, I'd like you to think about something. And since our time is limited, I won't sort of start with a conversation about it, but I'd like you to think about two things. Think back over the last year and think